It began quietly, in a way that most people in France never expected. A cold winter night fell over a small town outside Lyon, and for the first time in decades, the streetlights blinked, then faded into darkness. Elderly residents stepped outside with coats wrapped tight, looking up at the silent sky where the glow of the lamps used to be. Families found themselves lighting candles in their kitchens, confused and unsettled. France, a nation that once prided itself on stability and modernity, was suddenly facing the kind of power disruption usually associated with struggling economies. At the same time, thousands of miles away across the Mediterranean, a very different picture was unfolding. In parts of West Africa, new industrial zones lit up the evening horizon. Bright LED lights lined the entrances to processing plants, battery workshops, and mineral refining centers. Young engineers walked out after long shifts, proud of the work they were doing, finally seeing their region invest in itself instead of watching its wealth shipped away. These two realities, one fading into darkness and the other rising into light, were connected by a story most people in the West were never taught in school. For generations, the comfort of Europe was quietly powered by the minerals, energy, and agricultural wealth of Africa. Uranium from the Sahel kept French nuclear reactors running. Cocoa from West Africa filled supermarket shelves. Rare minerals used in cars, smartphones, satellites, and even military aircraft flowed steadily into European factories. But Africa has changed. A new generation of leaders, including voices like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, is demanding that the value of African resources finally stay on African soil. And for the first time in modern history, France is feeling what happens when a continent it once took for granted decides to stand on its own terms. If stories like this make you pause and question what really holds up global power, stay with me, because the truth behind Africa's rise and France's panic will shape the world your children and grandchildren inherit. And the deeper we look into this shift, the more we see that it is not only an economic story. It is a story about dignity, justice, and the long-delayed correction of history. For decades, France operated with the quiet confidence that its access to African resources would never be seriously challenged. But the change did not come with a sudden explosion. It began with simple questions whispered in African classrooms, ministries, and town councils, questions that grew louder each year. Why were nations rich in uranium still importing high-cost electricity? Why were the world's best cocoa beans being exported for pennies while chocolate factories in Europe made billions? Why were African engineers working abroad instead of building industries at home? These questions gained force as a new generation of African leaders stepped forward, determined to stop the cycle that pushed wealth outward while leaving their nations struggling with unemployment and limited opportunities. In Burkina Faso, the government began reviewing contracts tied to gold and manganese, asking why local communities saw so little benefit from mines that had operated for years. In Niger, discussions intensified over uranium extraction, the mineral that powered most of France's nuclear plants and kept French lights on for generations. Young citizens in Mali and the Ivory Coast started online campaigns calling for value to stay at home rather than being exported as raw materials. This shift was not driven by ideology alone. It came from real people who felt the consequences of old arrangements. One example is a farmer in southern Burkina Faso named Musa, who worked the same land his family had tended for generations. He grew cotton and small crops for the local market, but every planting season he watched trucks carrying raw minerals drive past his village on their way to foreign-owned processing sites. His son, an intelligent teenager with a passion for mechanics, dreamed of becoming an engineer. But with no local factories or training programs, he faced a choice: leave his country or abandon his dream. When the government announced plans to build mineral processing facilities and technical schools within the region, Musa said it was the first time he believed his son might have a future at home. He was not alone. Across West Africa, families began imagining a different kind of future, one in which African minerals funded African growth. Governments soon turned those hopes into policy. The first major announcement came from a uranium supplier in the Sahel region that declared exports would be paused until local processing plants were built with African engineers in key positions. France, which relied heavily on this uranium to power its nuclear grid, immediately felt the pressure. Energy companies warned that without steady shipments from Africa, electricity prices could rise and supply could fluctuate. Behind closed doors in Paris, ministers received briefings that predicted potential shortages. What seemed like a distant African decision suddenly became a domestic crisis. Within weeks, other African nations followed similar paths. A major cocoa-producing country declared it would halt raw bean exports and start manufacturing chocolate and confectionery products domestically, explaining that exporting raw crops while importing finished goods at 10 times the cost made no economic sense. European companies protested, but African leaders insisted that their nations needed jobs, factories, and real value, rather than continuing to serve as low-cost suppliers to foreign markets. Soon after, countries rich in cobalt, manganese, and other strategic minerals announced new regulations. Unprocessed minerals would no longer be shipped abroad without strong agreements ensuring that part of the refining process took place in Africa. Some companies even received their final shipments accompanied by clear notices stating that future processing must occur on African soil. These decisions reshaped global supply chains almost instantly. French car manufacturers began reporting shortages of key metals. Technology firms signaled delays in producing smartphones and batteries. Aerospace companies struggled to complete essential components for jets and satellites because rare earth inventories were dwindling. Even France's defense sector felt the strain, as parts required for advanced aircraft became harder to acquire. For ordinary African citizens, these changes brought new opportunities. Technical schools expanded engineering programs. Industrial zones attracted investment. Skilled jobs once concentrated in Europe started moving south. For the first time in generations, Africa began building an industrial foundation rather than watching its wealth depart for foreign ports. For ordinary French families, the impact was very different. As shipments slowed, the cost of energy rose. Electricity bills climbed, and small businesses struggled to adapt. Households began noticing shortages in supermarkets, particularly products sourced from Africa. Many French citizens had never realized how deeply their daily lives depended on resources originating from the African continent. This divergence between African progress and French disruption created a quiet but powerful shift in the global economic landscape. And as each African nation took stronger control over its resources, the pressure on France intensified. It was becoming clear that what once looked like a minor adjustment in African policy was rapidly transforming into a fundamental challenge to France's economic foundations. If you have ever watched a company, a community, or even a family face the consequences of years of ignoring uncomfortable truths, then you understand the weight of what France was beginning to experience. But even with these early shocks, the most dramatic consequences were still ahead, because the next stage of Africa's transformation would hit France in ways no one in Paris had fully prepared for. The moment France realized the situation had spiraled beyond its control came quietly, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a single internal report delivered to the Ministry of Energy. The document projected that within just a few months, France could face real electricity shortages if African uranium shipments did not resume. Nuclear power plants that had always relied on steady deliveries from the Sahel were suddenly running at reduced capacity. When this information leaked to a French newspaper, panic spread through financial markets. Investors pulled back, energy companies issued warnings, and regional officials demanded emergency meetings. For the first time in modern history, France was confronting the possibility that its decades-long assumption of guaranteed access to African resources was no longer true. Across the Atlantic, American analysts began paying attention, especially those in national security circles who understood how fragile supply chains could affect global stability. But inside Africa, the reaction was profoundly different. In countries like Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, people gathered in town squares and community halls to celebrate what they saw as a turn toward economic dignity. Young people carried signs saying that Africa's wealth must finally serve Africans, not foreign corporations. In coastal cities, local television stations aired discussions about how new industrial zones and battery factories could help reduce unemployment. Elderly men and women who had lived through years of economic hardship watched these developments with a cautious but real sense of hope. In Ghana, a young engineer named Samuel, who had been working at a small workshop repairing generators, spoke to reporters after hearing that his region might soon host a facility to refine manganese and produce battery components. He said that for years he had watched his friends leave the country seeking better opportunities, while he stayed behind to support his aging parents. Now he believed he might finally have a future without leaving home. His story mirrored thousands across West Africa, where families began to imagine a world in which the continent was no longer the world's supplier of cheap raw materials, but a producer of finished goods. While Africa experienced this growing optimism, France found itself in a deepening crisis. The first major protests erupted near government buildings as electricity bills soared and shortages caused sporadic blackouts. Many older French citizens, who had lived through earlier economic downturns, said they had not felt this level of uncertainty in decades. Businesses that depended on stable electricity saw operating costs jump dramatically. Small restaurants, bakeries, and workshops struggled to keep their doors open. Meanwhile, European food companies scrambled to adapt to Africa's suspension of raw cocoa exports. Chocolate producers in France warned that prices could rise sharply and that supplies might become limited. Coffee roasters faced similar challenges. Grocery chains raised prices, fueling frustration among consumers. France's manufacturing sector, already under pressure, began shrinking. Auto companies reduced production targets due to shortages of cobalt and manganese. Tech firms warned that smartphones and advanced electronics could face delays. The aerospace industry, one of France's key national pride sectors, reported critical shortages of rare earth materials needed for aircraft components. Defense contractors expressed concerns that they could not meet commitments for advanced jets if mineral supplies continued to shrink. These cascading problems triggered political turmoil. Rival parties accused one another of ignoring warnings from African leaders and failing to invest in alternatives. Some politicians urged a complete overhaul of France's foreign policy toward Africa, calling for respect-based partnerships. Others clung to outdated assumptions, insisting that African nations would eventually return to old arrangements. But those assumptions crumbled as African leaders held firm. They repeated a simple message: Africa's resources must serve Africa first. African newspapers highlighted stories of new university programs training engineers, geologists, and technicians. Community radio stations broadcast updates about construction projects, pipelines, and emerging partnerships with Asia and the Gulf region. In many cities, young entrepreneurs began forming cooperatives to develop local industries and small-scale manufacturing. This momentum gave people a sense of purpose and pride they had not felt in decades. For African families, the change felt like the beginning of a long, overdue shift. For French families, it felt like watching a world they had counted on slip away piece by piece. If you have ever lived through a time when everything familiar suddenly seemed unstable, then you understand the fear many French citizens were beginning to feel. And if you have ever seen a community rise after generations of struggle, then you understand the hope spreading across African capitals. These two emotions, fear in Europe and hope in Africa, collided on the global stage as governments debated what to do next. But even with all this turmoil, the most profound consequences had not yet arrived, because the next phase of Africa's transformation would impact the world far beyond France, reaching into the strategic interests of the United States itself. As Africa's new policies took hold and France's economic foundations shook, the consequences reached deeply into the everyday lives of people on both sides of the Mediterranean. In Paris, small apartment buildings that once relied on steady, affordable electricity began facing rising utility costs. Older residents on fixed incomes had to choose between heating their homes or covering medical bills. Families who once took France's stability for granted found themselves adjusting to a more uncertain reality, where blackouts occasionally disrupted evening routines and grocery stores raised prices on products that had always been inexpensive. Many French parents noticed that everyday items such as chocolate, coffee, nuts, and certain fruits became harder to find or significantly more expensive because the agricultural exports from Africa were now being redirected or processed locally. Meanwhile, French farmers faced their own troubles. Fertilizer imports linked to African suppliers became inconsistent, forcing farmers to pay higher prices for replacements. This pushed food costs higher across the country and made rural communities feel abandoned by policymakers who assured them that France was strong enough to withstand external shocks. Local councils held emergency meetings to discuss how to support struggling families and small businesses. Yet despite the mounting pressure, political leaders in Paris struggled to present a unified plan. Some argued that France should quickly renegotiate access to African minerals and food products, offering fairer terms and mutual partnerships. Others insisted that France must reduce its dependence on foreign resources, even if doing so would take years and require painful transitions. Arguments spilled into national debates and talk shows, creating deep political divides. Protest movements grew, not just about energy prices, but also about the feeling that the government had ignored warning signs for decades. For many French citizens, the realization that their country had relied so heavily on African resources was both surprising and unsettling. It challenged long-held beliefs about national strength and self-sufficiency. On the other side of the story, Africa was experiencing consequences of its own, but they were dramatically different. In countries across West and Central Africa, new industrial zones brought hope and employment. Cities once marked by limited opportunities began buzzing with construction sites, training centers, and investment projects. Community leaders reported increases in school enrollment as parents believed their children might finally have a chance to benefit directly from the wealth beneath their feet. One family in Côte d'Ivoire saw their eldest daughter, Amani, become the first in their village to study industrial chemistry at a regional university, thanks to new scholarships funded by mineral revenues. Her father, a retired cocoa farmer, said he never imagined his daughter would one day help develop local chocolate production facilities. He described feeling proud that Africa was finally turning its natural wealth into something that belonged to its people. But alongside the optimism, Africa also faced challenges. The transition to domestic refining and manufacturing required significant investments, technical expertise, and reliable infrastructure. Some regions struggled to keep pace with the sudden economic transformation. Governments had to manage expectations carefully, balancing national pride with the reality that building a strong industrial foundation takes time. Still, the overall sentiment in African capitals was one of determination. Citizens felt empowered knowing that their resources were no longer leaving the continent without creating local value. This shift changed political dynamics as well. Leaders who supported sovereignty and economic independence gained public trust, while those seen as too close to former colonial powers faced criticism. In several countries, political coalitions formed around the idea of regional economic unity, arguing that Africa's future strength depended on cooperation across borders. These movements emphasized the importance of African-led development rather than reliance on external powers. In contrast, the political climate in France grew increasingly strained. Members of parliament clashed over whether France should attempt to regain influence in Africa or accept a reduced role in the region. Some politicians warned that if France did not adjust quickly, it could lose not only Africa as a partner, but also its position within Europe and global markets. Others called for new trade agreements built on fairness rather than historical privilege. The most striking consequence of all was the shift in public awareness. French citizens who once felt disconnected from African affairs now realized that events in Niamey, Ouagadougou, and Accra could shape the price of electricity, food, and manufactured goods in their own homes. American observers watching from afar began to notice the same truth. If African nations could reshape France's economy so profoundly, what would happen if the United States ignored Africa's rise or failed to understand its strategic importance? This question grew louder as global markets continued to reorient themselves around African-controlled minerals and manufacturing. And as France struggled to adapt, Africa's confidence only increased, setting the stage for a new geopolitical landscape that would reach far beyond Europe. But even as these consequences unfolded on both continents, another layer of the story was emerging, one that would pull the United States directly into the center of the debate. Because in the next phase of Africa's transformation, the real question was no longer whether France could adjust. It was whether America could afford not to. As France struggled to understand the new world forming around it, policymakers in Washington began looking closely at the situation with a mixture of concern and clarity. For years, the United States viewed Africa mainly through the lens of counterterrorism efforts and humanitarian programs, but the crisis unfolding in France revealed something far more important. The minerals that Africa was now protecting so firmly were the same minerals essential to America's economic future. Cobalt, manganese, nickel, rare earths, and lithium are the backbone of electric vehicles, advanced batteries, satellites, radar systems, and precision-guided military technology. These are not distant or abstract concerns. They touch everything from the trucks Americans drive to the national defense systems that protect the country. Senior officials at the Pentagon and the State Department quietly acknowledged that Africa's new direction could reshape global power dynamics for decades. While France was feeling the immediate shock, the United States recognized that ignoring Africa's rise would carry long-term risks. American analysts also observed that while Europe struggled to adjust, other global powers were moving quickly. China and Gulf nations offered long-term infrastructure deals, technology exchanges, and joint ventures that treated African governments as equal partners. These offers were appealing because they respected sovereignty and allowed Africa to build value within its borders rather than losing it abroad. American diplomats knew that if the United States failed to show the same respect, it could lose influence in a region that will define the future of clean energy, global manufacturing, and digital technology. For many Americans, especially older viewers who remember the energy crises of the 1970s, the idea of relying heavily on foreign resources is not new. But what is new is the reality that Africa is no longer willing to give away its mineral wealth without fair terms. If the United States hopes to maintain stability in global supply chains, it needs strong, respectful partnerships with African nations, not temporary arrangements built on convenience. And as American officials considered these questions, they also began to see something hopeful. Africa's rise does not have to threaten American interests. It can expand them if the United States chooses to engage with humility and fairness. If you believe that America's strength has always come from building honest partnerships rather than exploiting weaknesses, then the decisions Washington makes in the coming years will matter deeply. Because the next chapter of this story is not only about France losing influence. It is about whether the United States is prepared for a world where Africa stands not as a resource base, but as a global economic power, with choices, leverage, and vision. And the answer to that question will shape what happens next. As the dust settled on France's economic crisis and Africa's new direction became impossible to ignore, a larger truth emerged, one that reached far beyond any single nation. The world was entering a new era where old assumptions no longer held, and where countries that had been overlooked or underestimated were shaping global markets in ways that few Western leaders had ever prepared for. Africa's decision to reclaim its mineral wealth was not an act of retaliation, but a declaration that the long chapter of unequal exchange had reached its natural end. For the first time in generations, African nations were building industries that belonged to them, developing technologies on their own soil, and crafting policies that reflected their own priorities rather than the expectations of foreign capitals. This shift has already changed France's economy in ways that once seemed unimaginable, but the broader consequences are still unfolding. If Africa continues to expand its control over strategic minerals, the entire global economy will have to adjust. Supply chains will reroute, partnerships will be tested, and nations that once took African resources for granted will need to rethink what true cooperation looks like. Some American analysts warn that if the United States does not recognize Africa's growing influence within the next few years, it could lose critical ground in clean energy, manufacturing, and national security. Others see opportunity, believing that respectful partnerships with African nations could create a more stable and prosperous global economy. The question for all of us, especially those who have lived long enough to see the world change many times, is simple. Is Africa's rise a threat to the existing order, or is it a long overdue correction that brings fairness back into the global system? If this story has made you pause and reconsider what you thought you knew about the world, I invite you to reflect on what justice and dignity truly mean between nations. Do we fear change because it challenges old comforts? Or can we see it as a moment where new relationships grounded in equality become possible? If you believe in fairness, in the value of every human life, and in the hope that nations can finally rise on their own terms, then let this moment speak to you. And if you feel moved to share your thoughts, your worries, or your hopes, your voice may help shape the conversation in ways that matter more than you realize. May God guide all of us toward a future where countries prosper, not by taking from others, but by standing together with courage, honesty, and respect. Because Africa's rise is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of a world where destiny is finally written by those who own the land beneath their feet.